She was hailed as the most beautiful woman in the world, a fairy tale empress draped in glittering opulence, her every move scrutinized and criticized by an empire both captivated and unforgiving. Yet behind the shimmering facade of palaces and diamond-studded tiaras lay a woman desperate to escape, a restless spirit hiding behind veils and walls, longing for freedom. Married at just 15 to a man she had never met, Elisabeth of Austria Sisi was thrust into a world of rigid traditions and suffocating expectations. Tormented by a domineering mother-in-law who demanded total submission, she defied the constraints of her gilded cage. But her rebellion came at a price, one measured in gossip of court scandals, rumors of affairs, and even whispers of an illegitimate child. Her legendary beauty, achieved through obsessive rituals of raw veal masks and fasting diets, left her a mere shadow of herself. Yet it was her grief and rebellion that truly defined her. She watched as her daughter faded away before her eyes, mourned a son whose scandalous death shook an empire to its core, and communed with ghosts in her lonely search for solace. Sisi crowned herself in the adoration of one empire even as she fled another that reviled her, veiling herself in mourning black as she wandered Europe like a specter, seeking escape from a life that was never truly hers. This is the story of an empress whose passion and rebellion shook the foundations of a crumbling monarchy, who wrote poetry for a future she would never see, and whose life ended not in the slow decay of time, but by the blade of an assassin. From the glittering halls of Vienna to the tragedy of Mayerling, from her restless wanderings to her untimely death on the shores of Lake Geneva, Sisi's life unfolds as a symphony of heartbreak, scandal, and enduring mystery. This is her story, a legacy of beauty, rebellion, and sorrow that continues to haunt history. If you like stories like this, please consider subscribing. We have 70 women's biographies on the channel and post new content every week. And now let's unravel the story of Elisabeth, the secrets and tragedies of Austria's most mysterious empress. Elisabeth Amalie Eugenie, known to the world as Sisi, was born on December 24, 1837, into the sprawling ducal family of Bavaria. The Christmas child grew up far from the pomp and pageantry of court life, surrounded instead by the untamed beauty of nature. Among her 7 siblings, she thrived in a world of horseback riding, swimming, fishing, and mountain climbing, spending her happiest days at the family's summer retreat, Possenhofen, on the serene shores of Lake Starnberg. Speaking the Bavarian dialect and playing with local peasant children, Sisi's upbringing was marked by freedom, but little refinement. Like her father, Duke Maximilian, she held no reverence for protocol or ceremony. Maximilian himself was a curious figure, a man of intellect and eccentricity, more at home among scholars and artists than nobility. His palace boasted a private circus where Munich's elite watched him perform equestrian feats. A liberal thinker, he penned anonymous articles on history and dined daily with his 2 beloved, illegitimate daughters. His carefree attitude left Ludovica, Sisi's mother, to manage the household and navigate the challenges of finding suitable matches for her children. The marriage had not been one of love, but one of duty. Ludovica cried on her wedding night, and Max told her that she was not the woman he loved. He carried on numerous affairs, was away often, and Ludovica was left isolated, finding joy in raising her children. Ludovica feared Sisi's future prospects, once lamenting, "True, she is pretty because she is young and animated, but alas, she has no single pretty feature." In contrast, Sisi's elder sister, Helene, was considered the jewel of the family, serious, educated, and admired. It was Helene, not Sisi, who was intended to marry Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria. Franz Joseph, at 23 years old, was the picture of imperial perfection. With blonde hair, soft features, and a slender frame accentuated by his tightly fitted general's uniform, he exuded youthful charm and discipline. As ruler of the vast Austrian Empire, a dominion second only to Russia in size, with 40 million inhabitants and an army of 600,000, he seemed untouchable. Yet, the emperor had already survived an assassination attempt in 1853 when a Hungarian journeyman stabbed him in the neck. Displaying remarkable composure, Franz Joseph remarked, "Now I am wounded along with my soldiers." The emperor's closest confidant was his formidable mother, Archduchess Sophie, often described as the only man at court swarming with weaklings. Having forfeited her own chance to become empress due to her husband's perceived frailty, Sophie orchestrated her son's rise to power and wielded considerable influence over the empire. She was equally determined to secure the perfect match for Franz Joseph, but earlier efforts to align him with German and Prussian princesses had failed. The next prospect was Helene, Sophie's niece. In the summer of 1853, Ludovica brought Helene and a reluctant Sisi to Austria, hoping to finalize the engagement. Sisi was still recovering from a broken heart. She had fallen in love with someone in her father's service, and after a period he was sent away. When he returned, he was gravely ill and shortly died. Sisi would spend hours alone in the fields or her room mourning this loss, composing poetry to him, and the hope was the journey could improve her mood. The journey was plagued with mishaps. Her mother suffered a migraine, and all they had with them was their black mourning attire, for an aunt had recently died. The carriage with their gowns and ladies had not yet arrived. Sophie sent her personal servant to help prepare Helene, bathing and washing her hair, but she still had to wear the austere mourning dress, which did not flatter her. Some would say that it was this moment that changed her life, but it was the shy and unassuming Sisi who caught Franz Joseph's eye. From the moment he saw her, Franz Joseph was entranced. "Oh, how sweet Sisi is. She's as fresh as a budding almond, and what a magnificent crown of hair frames her face," he exclaimed. At the evening ball, while Helene dazzled in a white silk gown, Sisi appeared in a plain pink frock. Yet it was Sisi whom Franz Joseph chose to dance the cotillion with, signaling his decision by presenting her with his nosegay. Despite Sophie's attempts to dissuade him, the emperor's heart was set. Sisi, however, was overwhelmed. When asked if she loved Franz Joseph, she tearfully replied, "How could anyone not love that man? But how can he think of me? I'm so unimportant." Her humility only endeared her further to the smitten emperor. Their engagement was swiftly announced, bringing joy to Ludovica, but leaving Sisi with mixed emotions. The young bride-to-be reflected on the moment years later with bitterness. Marriage is an absurd arrangement. One is sold as a 15-year-old child, makes a vow one does not understand, and then regrets it for 30 years or more. Nonetheless, preparations for the imperial wedding proceeded. Franz Joseph showered Sisi with affection and gifts, writing to his mother, "Every day I love Sisi more, and I am ever more convinced that no one else could suit me better than she." But behind her shy smiles, Sisi spent much of her time alone, crying. On April 20th, 1854, Sisi bid an emotional farewell to her native Munich. Crowds gathered to watch her departure, their cheers mingling with her tears. Traveling down the Danube on a grand barge, she was greeted as a future empress at every stop. When she arrived in Vienna on April 22nd, Franz Joseph greeted her with boundless enthusiasm, kissing her in front of tens of thousands of adoring spectators. Vienna, however, was not the fairy tale she might have imagined. Sisi entered a rigid court dominated by the formidable Countess Esterhazy, a trusted ally of Archduchess Sophie. The Countess, with her puritanical adherence to protocol, immediately clashed with Sisi's free-spirited nature, setting the stage for years of conflict and unhappiness. The imperial wedding was a dazzling spectacle, a kaleidoscope of grandeur and hope, meant to mask the deep fractures in an empire grappling with famine, cholera, and despair. Cannons roared, church bells tolled, and Vienna's streets swelled with cheers, as though the joy of the day could mend the fractures beneath. But for Elisabeth, or Sisi as she was lovingly called, this was no fairy tale. The gilded pageantry marked the beginning of a life weighed down by duty, isolation, and the unrelenting sacrifice of her cherished freedom. In the weeks before her wedding, the Austrian people saw in her a savior, a beacon of compassion amidst their suffering. Pamphlets begged her to bridge the gulf between ruler and ruled. "You and your house will be the beacon that rescues the shipwrecked." Yet these pleas, heartfelt as they were, never reached her hands. Sisi had spent her life in the open air of Possenhofen, embracing nature's simplicity and a disdain for aristocratic pomp. Her kind heart and disdain for superficiality, traits that had once set her apart, were now viewed as naivete, as deficiencies unfit for the Viennese court. The days leading to her wedding were a blur of endless introductions, glittering balls, and suffocating rituals. Sisi, already a reluctant bride, found herself swept into a world of rigid formality. Her attempts to find refuge, speaking in secret English with her sister Helene, or sneaking a moment to herself, were met with swift reprimands. Every misstep was scrutinized, every tear dismissed as ungratefulness. On April 24, 1854, Vienna erupted in celebration as Sisi exchanged vows with Emperor Franz Joseph. Bread was distributed to the starving, prisoners were freed, and children were clothed. Even the national anthem was rewritten to honor the young empress. For a fleeting moment, she was the symbol of hope for an empire desperate for change. As the bells pealed and the cannons roared, the crowd hoped she might temper Franz Joseph's stern rule, softening the iron grip of his mother, Archduchess Sophie. Yet, behind the shimmering veils and diamond tiaras, Sisi struggled. The weight of expectation pressed down on her, heavier than the gilded crown she would soon wear. After hours of relentless ceremony, she fled to an adjoining room, breaking into tears. Her instinctive embrace of her cousins, a rare moment of unguarded affection, was met with Sophie's sharp disapproval. Franz Joseph, deeply enamored, comforted her, delaying the consummation of their marriage until the third night, a scandal that rippled quietly through court whispers but only deepened his devotion. The days following the wedding were a relentless parade of duties. Balls and banquets, state dinners and audiences left little time for the couple to be alone. Even on their honeymoon, Sisi was surrounded by ladies-in-waiting who monitored her every move. Isolated and aching for home, she poured her sorrow into poetry. I long for the sun of home, and I have awakened in a dungeon with chains on my hands. Her words betrayed the loneliness of a girl thrust into a life she neither chose nor fully understood. From the wild child of Possenhofen to the reluctant Empress of Austria, Sisi's transformation was marked by heartbreak, homesickness, and a longing for the simplicity she had left behind. Though her beauty captivated the crowds and Franz Joseph's love was unwavering, the rigid life of the Viennese court threatened to extinguish the free spirit that had once run wild through Bavarian meadows. She wept for her homeland, her lost love, and the freedom she could never reclaim, a prisoner in a palace of gold. The lavish jewels and gowns, symbols of her elevated status, became burdens as she was forced to change outfits several times a day, often at the hands of strangers. Franz Joseph adored her deeply, but his devotion to his mother, Archduchess Sophie, outweighed his willingness to shield Sisi from the rigors of court life. Sophie, who had orchestrated her son's rise to power, took it upon herself to oversee Sisi's every move. Sisi later reflected, "I was at the mercy of this malicious woman, and everything I did was wrong." Though Sisi would come to admit that Sophie likely meant well, her methods left Sisi isolated and humiliated. Even Franz Joseph, accustomed to Sophie's dominating presence, could not escape her influence. Franz Joseph was often away in meetings about the looming war, leaving Sisi alone, under Sophie's constant watch. "I was afraid every moment when she came," Sisi later confessed, "and she came every day at any hour to spy on me." Sisi's only solace came during her visits to orphanages, schools, and hospitals. Her natural kindness and ability to connect with the lower classes endeared her to the public. But within the palace, Sisi had no one to confide in. Her sister and mother were far away, and Sophie warned her that sharing her thoughts with anyone could compromise her position as empress. Amidst this loneliness, the political backdrop offered no reprieve. Austria was losing allies, gaining enemies, and facing mounting unrest. Sisi knew little of these events, as she was instead instructed in languages, dance, and the ever-present gossip of court. 3 weeks into her marriage, Sisi became pregnant, a development that only deepened her depression. Sophie insisted she make public appearances to display her growing belly, a spectacle Sisi found degrading. "All I wanted was to be alone and weep," she said. When her first child, Sophie, was born, Sisi was denied any control. She could not choose her daughter's name, nanny, or even her quarters. Over a year later, in 1856, Sisi gave birth to a second daughter. The disappointment that the child was not a boy rippled through court, and once again, the child was taken under Sophie's supervision. As time passed, Sisi's confidence began to grow. Her popularity among the people soared, as many believed she influenced Franz Joseph to implement gentler policies. When she heard of the Protestant minority's plight in Catholic Vienna, she made a generous donation to their church, further cementing her reputation as a compassionate empress. This act, however, deepened the divide between Sisi and Sophie, who saw her as an opponent. The turning point came when Sisi demanded her children be moved closer to her. The resulting conflict with Sophie was fierce, but for the first time, Franz Joseph sided with his wife. Sisi won her first significant victory, marking the beginning of a shift in her role at court. Her newfound confidence carried her through a tour of the provinces. In Italy, she faced a cold reception, but in Hungary, the people adored her. Sisi found the warmth and openness of the Hungarians a welcome contrast to the rigid formalities of Vienna. The Hungarians began attributing any political relaxations to her influence, further solidifying her bond with the nation. She demanded that her children be allowed to travel with her, and though young Sophie had a small fever, the Archduchess was forced to relent when the Emperor came down on the side of his wife. However, tragedy struck when young Sophie's health worsened in Hungary, and over a grueling 12-hour period, with her parents by her side, the young child slowly died. And the family returned with her body to Vienna. Sisi was inconsolable. She withdrew from everyone, weeping for days. Devastated, she relinquished all control of her second daughter to the Archduchess. Yet the bond between Sisi and Franz Joseph remained strong, and the birth of Crown Prince Rudolph on August 21, 1858, was a moment of immense celebration for the Habsburg monarchy. The arrival of a male heir was heralded with overwhelming joy, and 6 hours after his birth, Rudolph was appointed a colonel in the army, a gesture steeped in the military traditions of the empire, though it foreshadowed tensions that would later plague father and son. Despite the public jubilation, Sisi's experience was far from idyllic. Denied the right to name her own son, she suffered from milk congestion and recurring fevers, enduring her role in silence as the court dictated every aspect of her motherhood. By this time, Sisi's disdain for court life had grown palpable. She found solace in rebellion, welcoming her brother's decision to renounce his title and marry an actress, acts that scandalized the aristocracy. Sisi even cultivated a close relationship with her new sister-in-law, defying expectations of propriety. Meanwhile, war broke out in the Italian provinces, leaving Austria isolated in its efforts to suppress the uprisings. Franz Joseph, ever the dutiful ruler, traveled to the front lines in an attempt to rally his troops. His bravery impressed many, but it left Sisi devastated. She begged him not to go, her fears for his safety constantly worrying her. When he left, she withdrew into herself, refusing to eat, sleeping through the days, and sinking deeper into despair. The court grew increasingly critical of Sisi's behavior, branding her unfit as both an empress and a woman. Scandal erupted when she began smoking openly, a habit shocking to the rigid sensibilities of the Viennese elite. Franz Joseph, desperate to restore her reputation, wrote pleading letters, urging her to engage with the public and reinvigorate their morale. Meanwhile, on the battlefield, Austria suffered devastating defeats. The bloodiest battles of the war exposed Franz Joseph's shortcomings as a military leader, tarnishing his image and sowing seeds of discontent among his people. It was in the midst of these horrors that Henri Dunant, shaken by the sight of the wounded, conceived the idea that would become the Red Cross. Yet back in Vienna, the emperor faced mounting criticism. Public anger over the mismanagement of the war and economic hardship reached a fever pitch, with calls for his abdication echoing through coffeehouses and taverns. Sisi, heeding Franz Joseph's pleas, took steps to bolster morale. She organized a hospital for the wounded, appalled by the lack of medical provisions amidst a lavishly funded military campaign. Sisi's compassion and growing awareness of the country's struggles led her to read the papers daily, informing herself of Austria's mounting crises. She even dared to advise her husband to listen to his people and seek peace, an idea met with fury by Archduchess Sophie, who viewed Sisi's suggestions as meddlesome. Despite resistance, Franz Joseph was ultimately forced into peace, further tarnishing his standing as the empire's ruler. The once revered emperor was now a figure of derision, his name cursed in the streets of Vienna as revolutions stirred in Hungary. Amidst the political chaos, Sisi's own beliefs began to crystallize. She advocated for constitutional reform, envisioning a more modern Austria, that stood in stark opposition to Sophie's staunch traditionalism. Though her influence was still limited, Sisi's quiet defiance hinted at the strength and determination that would define her later years, even as she navigated a court that seemed intent on breaking her spirit. By the 1860s, Sisi's life had become a paradox, a fragile figure of immense strength, whose beauty became both her armor and her prison. Despite her growing interest in politics, she remained shut out of all significant discussions. Franz Joseph continued to defer to his mother, Archduchess Sophie, whose shadow loomed over every decision. Rumors swirled around court about Franz Joseph's affairs, whispers that Sisi did little to confront. Instead, she threw herself into court life, hosting 6 extravagant balls in the spring of 1860. She danced with abandon until the early hours, dazzling onlookers but vexing Sophie with her wild defiance. The strain between the imperial couple deepened, and Sisi escaped to Bavaria to be with her family. She returned reluctantly for Franz Joseph's birthday in August, thinner than ever. Her waist now the result of starvation diets that sometimes consisted only of broth or gravy. The endless pressure of court life and her grueling regime led to a breakdown that autumn. Doctors recommended a warmer climate for her recovery, and Sisi chose Madeira, far from Vienna and its suffocating expectations. To Sophie and the court, her illness was seen as a convenient excuse to shirk her duties as empress. Some speculated that Sisi had contracted a venereal disease from Franz Joseph. Others dismissed her as neurotic. Modern scholars suggest she suffered from anorexia nervosa, her physical health closely tied to her mental state. When surrounded by loved ones, her condition improved, but any return to court triggered a relapse. In Madeira, she led a quiet life, walking with her dogs by day and playing cards by night. By May 1861, Sisi returned to Vienna full of health, but within days, her coughing fits, fever, and uncontrollable weeping resumed. Growing cold toward Franz Joseph, she locked him out of her bedroom and refused to eat. Her letters to her mother grew increasingly despairing. "I have been nothing but a burden," she wrote. "It would be better for the emperor if I died, so he could marry again." The court seethed with rumors of her death, and Franz Joseph, desperate to reconcile, traveled to Corfu, where Sisi had fled. She demanded her children be sent to her, but Franz Joseph refused, allowing only their relocation to Venice, where Sisi could visit them during the winter. This decision further enraged Sophie, who declared, "She is the Empress of Austria, yet the people never see her." In May 1862, Sisi returned to her family home in Bavaria, claiming she needed strength before facing Vienna once more. Her ladies-in-waiting were appalled by what they described as beggar's conditions, noting her mother's eccentric habits of feeding dogs at the table and picking fleas off them during meals. After 6 months, Sisi reluctantly returned to Vienna. The people greeted her with warmth, their adoration undimmed by her long absence. At court, however, she remained an outsider. Sisi's growing beauty became her weapon, and she learned to wield it with devastating effect. She recognized the power she held over men, though she entertained no affairs. Her presence at balls created a sensation. Diplomats and noblemen found her mystifying, her silence interpreted as shyness by some and stupidity by others. Yet behind the enigmatic facade, Sisi was intensely aware of the world around her. During critical negotiations between Austria and Prussia, she refused to engage with the delegates, later confiding to a maid, "I could tell they did not like women. They were followers of Schopenhauer, and I could not stand such banal talk." Her relationship with her children, especially Rudolph, marked one of her few victories over Sophie. Sisi fought to control her son's education, calling the rigorous drilling he endured pure madness. When Sophie insisted on harsher discipline, Sisi stood her ground. "Either his teacher goes or I do," she told Franz Joseph. Fearing she would again flee court, the emperor sided with her. Rudolph's liberal tutors reflected Sisi's own progressive leanings, but their influence would later put him at odds with the conservative court. By the mid-1860s, the cult of Sisi's beauty was in full bloom. She was revered as one of the most beautiful women in the world, her every public appearance causing a sensation. Yet the lengths she went to maintain her image bordered on obsession. Her diets were punishing, her waist so tightly corseted she could scarcely breathe. Her hair, which fell to her feet, required entire days for washing and 3 hours of daily styling. Any stray strand that fell during brushing sent her into a fury, prompting her hairdresser to hide them. Her beauty rituals were exhaustive: raw veal masks, warm oil baths, and 6 egg whites mixed with salt to preserve her complexion. Her niece once remarked, her all-consuming love was her own beauty. She saw it as her life's work to remain young. Sisi herself seemed to acknowledge this. Her dressing rituals took hours, and she often changed multiple times a day, leaving little time for her children or husband. Yet, by sheer force of will and her incomparable beauty, she triumphed over her adversaries at court. Even Franz Joseph, once the stronger partner, now deferred to her in personal matters. She exercised to exhaustion, fenced, lifted weights, and did gymnastics. She was so concerned with her outward appearance that at official engagements, she would refuse to open her lips for fear of showing her bad teeth, making her enunciation often unintelligible. Sisi's rise was not through wit or diplomacy, but through the magnetic allure of her presence. She had become an empress admired from afar, yet deeply lonely, forever haunted by the freedom she had left behind. Elisabeth's growing interest in Hungary marked a pivotal chapter in her life, one shaped by her empathy for an oppressed nation and defiance of Austria's rigid autocracy. The Revolution of 1848, which had brought Franz Joseph to power after his uncle's abdication, left Hungary stripped of its autonomy. While Archduchess Sophie remained an ardent defender of absolute rule, Elisabeth emerged as an unlikely champion for Hungarian freedom. Elisabeth's Hungarian sympathies were nurtured by those closest to her. Her Hungarian history teacher presented Austria's past through the lens of Hungary's struggles, while Ida Ferenczi, her Hungarian lady-in-waiting, provided companionship and a deeper understanding of the culture. The Viennese court mocked Elisabeth for her halting French and Italian, but she mastered Hungarian, speaking it fluently with Ida and using it as a private language in a court where few understood it. This linguistic achievement was a profound symbol of her solidarity with Hungary. Elisabeth's admiration for Hungary deepened upon meeting Count Gyula Andrassy, a national hero and former revolutionary. Exiled and sentenced to death during the 1848 uprising, Andrassy had returned to Hungary as a respected statesman. Tales of his bravery preceded him, and their first meeting cemented Elisabeth's respect. Andrassy, captivated by Elisabeth's beauty and intellect, wrote her letters in coded Hungarian, delivered through Ida. When Andrassy visited Vienna to negotiate with Franz Joseph, Elisabeth boldly attended the meetings, clad in traditional Hungarian dress. Her flawless Hungarian stunned the delegation, and her heartfelt declaration to Andrassy, "When the emperor's affairs go badly in Italy, it pains me. When they go badly in Hungary, it kills me," brought him to her side. He later credited her as indispensable to Hungary's cause, writing, "If we succeed, it will be thanks to her." On a visit to Budapest, Elisabeth addressed the Diet in Hungarian, moving the assembly to tears. Her popularity in Hungary soared, but Vienna was less kind. Whispers of an affair with Andrassy only deepened her isolation from the Austrian court. Elisabeth loved deeply throughout her life and had many emotional affairs. This can be gleaned through her communications and poetry, where she often viewed herself as Queen of the Fairies. But she was deeply shy and preferred emotional love over physical. Given her status and the constant amount of eyes on her, it is extremely unlikely she had a physical affair with any of the men she surrounded herself with. And despite many warm letters, it seems she never forgave Franz Joseph for his affairs. And though he loved her deeply for the rest of his life, her love of him had cooled greatly by the time of her illnesses and flight from court. Austria, meanwhile, was in turmoil. The empire faced defeat by Prussia in 1866, territorial losses in Italy, and widespread famine and cholera outbreaks. Prussia attempted to stoke rebellion in Hungary, but Elisabeth's presence helped maintain stability. She urged Franz Joseph to grant Hungary autonomy, writing impassioned letters that combined personal appeals with political reasoning. "If you say no," she wrote, "you will forever be spared my pleas. But I at least will be able to look into our son's eyes and say I did all in my power." Franz Joseph faced immense pressure from all sides: anti-Hungarian factions, his overbearing mother, and a populace suffering from starvation and disease. He pleaded with Elisabeth to return to Vienna, reminding her she was queen of all his subjects, not just the Hungarians. Elisabeth, however, made her loyalties clear, remarking, "I do not blame the Czechs for rejecting Austrian rule. After all, Slavs belong with Slavs." In Vienna and Bohemia, Sisi became deeply disliked by the nobility, as they questioned why she did not show them such respect as she now showed Hungary. But Sisi had no interest in their words or thoughts. Finally, in 1867, Franz Joseph, besieged and deeply influenced by Elisabeth's relentless advocacy, agreed to the Austro-Hungarian Compromise. This landmark agreement established the dual monarchy, granting Hungary control over its domestic affairs while maintaining Franz Joseph as emperor and king. The compromise infuriated conservative elements at court, but Hungary celebrated Elisabeth as a national hero. At Franz Joseph's coronation as King of Hungary, Andrassy himself placed the crown upon his head, a poignant moment that symbolized their shared triumph. As a coronation gift, Hungary presented Elisabeth with Guftdola Castle, which became her cherished retreat. The compromise also marked a renewal of Elisabeth's marriage. Shortly afterward, she gave birth to her youngest child, Marie Valerie, in Hungary. Rumors that Andrassy fathered the child persisted, but Marie Valerie's striking resemblance to Franz Joseph silenced most whispers. Elisabeth was adored in Hungary, viewed as a true queen who had delivered them from oppression, and neither young nor old would hear any word against her. While in Austria, bitterness and resentment grew as to why she could not show them the same love she showered on Hungary. Now, though Elisabeth had triumphed, Sophie was sidelined, and she had achieved her goal. The absolute rule of the emperor was over, and Franz Joseph now reigned as a constitutional monarch in Hungary while maintaining absolute power in Austria, fermenting even more dissent. Sisi now spent much of her time in Hungary at her castle with her youngest daughter, Marie Valerie, while Franz Joseph and her two other children remained far away in Vienna. The imperial court, already skeptical of her unconventional ways, began whispering with even greater venom. For example, on Maundy Thursday, a sacred tradition required the emperor and empress to wash the feet of 12 disadvantaged men and women, the emperor attending to the men and the empress to the women. Sisi, loathing public spectacle and crowds, missed this ritual an astonishing 40 times. Yet she had her own methods. She would visit orphanages, hospitals, and poorhouses unannounced, inspecting facilities, tasting food, and speaking directly with the patients. She gave money and encouragement freely, earning their love and the nickname, the Good Fairy. While these unannounced visits delighted the patients, the staff deeply resented them. Sisi, though genuinely committed to helping people, despised the pomp and insincerity of official events, finding them utterly fake. At formal gatherings in Vienna, her silence was often interpreted as contempt rather than shyness, further alienating her from the rigid formalities of the imperial court. Isolation became her refuge, though she was never truly alone. A retinue of 60 attendants accompanied her everywhere. When asked why she chose to live as a hermit, Sisi replied with characteristic melancholy, "I have no alternative but to choose this life. I have been persecuted. So many evil things have been said about me. The forest does not hurt me. Nature is much more pleasant than humanity." Ironically, despite her own unhappy betrothal at 15, Sisi arranged a similarly young marriage for her eldest daughter, Gisela, to Prince Leopold of Bavaria. Though their marriage proved happy, Sisi's approach to her youngest daughter was strikingly different. "Marie Valerie can marry a chimney sweep if she wishes," she once declared, reflecting her disdain for the institution of marriage. "One never knows the value of freedom until it is lost," she lamented. In 1872, Archduchess Sophie, Sisi's ever-present adversary, passed away. The death of her beloved son Maximilian in Mexico had broken her spirit, and with Sophie's passing came the end of an era. The conservative stronghold at court mourned her loss, viewing Sophie as the guardian of tradition and moral authority. Liberals, however, now held greater power in both Austria and Hungary. Despite Sophie's absence, Sisi continued to avoid Vienna, a city she associated with suffocating expectations and relentless criticism. She and Franz Joseph saw each other only on special occasions, like birthdays or religious holidays. Her daughter Marie Valerie described their family Christmases as hollow. the gatherings marked by a heavy silence that underscored their growing estrangement. At her older daughter's wedding, Sisi made a rare public appearance, dazzling onlookers with her beauty. Her son Rudolph, however, was inconsolable, openly weeping for his sister, who had been his closest confidant during their mother's frequent absences. When her daughter gave birth to her first child, Sisi's reaction was as cold as it was cutting. The child is of rare ugliness, but very lively. It looks exactly like her mother. Sisi never truly grew close to her younger children, a distance she blamed on Sophie, who had taken them from her care during their formative years. This emotional void became a recurring theme in her life. During Vienna's World Exhibition in 1873, where leaders from across the globe gathered, Sisi excused herself from most events, to the great disappointment of the attendees. By then, her beauty and reclusiveness had achieved legendary status, and many viewed her as the main attraction. The Shah of Persia, a known rake, refused to leave Austria until he had met the elusive empress. Yet when the moment finally came, the Shah surprised everyone by becoming bashful and self-conscious in her presence, later declaring their brief meeting the highlight of my European tour. Later that year, Sisi returned to Vienna for Franz Joseph's 25th Jubilee, but each visit to the capital only fueled criticism of her. Every departure or absence was scrutinized, adding to her desire to stay as far away from Vienna as possible. When in the city, she spoke as little as possible. Critics claimed she neglected her duties as a wife, mother, and empress. In moments of candor with her ladies-in-waiting, Sisi expressed her deep dissatisfaction with her life. "One is sold as a child," she once confided, "and has to make vows one does not understand. Then one is a prisoner for the rest of her life." She longed for the carefree days of her youth, when she could roam the forests and daydream. The gilded cage of imperial life, coveted by so many, was her torment. Riding became her solace, a return to the freedom she had once known. In the late 1860s, she pursued the art of equestrianism with renewed fervor. Determined to master the skill, she constructed arenas near her Hungarian retreat and surrounded herself with circus riders and gypsies, sparing no expense in acquiring the finest horses. Riding became her escape, a fleeting moment of liberation. Her passion for riding eventually led her to England, where she joined the aristocracy's hunting circles. Queen Victoria, after meeting her, famously remarked, "I cannot call her a great beauty. I think the Princess of Wales is far prettier." Elizabeth remained undeterred, riding in Hyde Park to the amazement of onlookers and soon becoming a fixture at the hunts. She partnered with Captain Bay Middleton, one of England's most skilled riders, earning a reputation for her daring. She often outpaced the men, clearing obstacles and navigating treacherous terrain with ease. Yet her boldness also attracted criticism. Her son, Rudolph, disapproved of her relationship with Middleton, especially after rumors of an affair began to spread. A confrontation with Sisi's sister, the ex-Queen of Naples, who accused her outright, led to a permanent rift. Meanwhile, Rudolph, ever the intellectual and moral critic, anonymously published a pamphlet condemning the idle aristocracy and denouncing hunting as cruel. Sisi's relationship with her son became increasingly strained, mirroring the growing complexities of her life. Even as she sought freedom in the thrill of the hunt, she could not escape the shadows of rumor, familial discord, and the relentless gaze of a public that both adored and scrutinized her. Even as her hunting exploits captivated England, criticism was never far behind. Count Crenville, with biting disdain, remarked, "What an effect it would make if the Empress spent the 500,000 guldens from her trips abroad on aiding the hungry instead." The criticism wasn't limited to her expenses. By this time, Andrassy had become the Austro-Hungarian foreign minister, and whispers about an affair with him lingered. Her presence in political circles had been deemed inappropriate, and Sisi likely hoped to silence these murmurs by withdrawing from both Austria and politics altogether. Yet, as with Middleton, the rumors followed her wherever she went. To escape the scrutiny of the English court, Sisi began riding in Ireland, but this too led to scandal. Her presence as a Catholic empress in a country simmering with nationalist sentiment was seized upon by Irish leaders as a symbol of solidarity. She quickly became a beloved figure among the Irish people. Many believed her rides through the countryside symbolized support for their cause, and to this day, legends persist of a mysterious fairy queen on horseback. Writing to her mother, she wryly remarked, "One of the advantages of Ireland is that there is no royalty there." In August 1879, Sisi and Franz Joseph celebrated their silver wedding anniversary, but the occasion reflected their fractured relationship. At the celebratory gathering in Vienna, Sisi spoke to no one and walked out within 30 minutes, leaving behind an air of discontent. She later complained to her ladies-in-waiting about her age, her uninspired marriage, and the disapproving gazes she felt at court. Hunting remained her solace, the one pursuit that provided a sense of freedom. Yet even the exhilarating days on horseback often ended in tears. "Why must I return to my cage?" she lamented. "Why could I not have broken all my bones to put an end to it, to everything?" When her son, Rudolph, became engaged in 1880, Sisi briefly traveled to Brussels to meet his fiancée. Upon her arrival, Rudolph embraced her with fervor, kissing her hands repeatedly. Sisi, in turn, warmly embraced his young bride-to-be. The visit was brief, lasting only a day before Sisi returned to her hunts. Political tensions in Ireland had grown too precarious, so she resumed her riding in England, where she still sought the exhilaration of the chase. However, age began to catch up with her, and she experienced the early signs of rheumatism. By 1882, the growing jealousy of Middleton's fiancée added fuel to the already simmering rumors about their relationship. The English press turned critical, prompting Sisi to quip, "I would be surprised if anyone had anything nice to say about me." Middleton's marriage, coupled with Sisi's declining health, led her to abandon riding altogether. She sold her horses and shifted her obsession to walking. Sisi would walk for hours at an almost punishing pace, leaving her ladies-in-waiting gasping for breath as they struggled to keep up. When strangers began to recognize her, she adapted by walking at night, cloaked in the shadows, seeking solace in solitude, even as she exercised. Years later, she reunited briefly with Middleton in Amsterdam. They took long walks together, as they had in the past, trailed, as always, by her ever-watchful retinue. It was their final meeting. In 1892, Middleton died in a tragic riding accident, breaking his neck. His wife, in her grief, destroyed all their correspondence, ensuring that the true nature of his relationship with Sisi would remain an enigma. As the 1880s unfolded, Sisi's life became even more detached from Vienna and her imperial duties. In an attempt to ease her discomfort, Emperor Franz Joseph built her a private retreat, the Hermes Villa, at the heart of the Linz Deer Park. Designed to her tastes, it featured frescoes by a young Gustav Klimt, a statue of her favorite Greek god Hermes, and scenes from A Midsummer Night's Dream adorning her bedroom walls. The castle had high walls and guards, so no one would be able to glimpse her when she was in residence. She nicknamed it Titania's Dream Castle, finding solace in its secluded forest setting. Yet, Sisi only visited the villa sparingly, preferring instead to escape further afield. By this time, Sisi was grappling with aging. Nearly 50, her beauty faded, she concealed herself behind fans and parasols. Her once vigorous rides were replaced by long, solitary walks. Her health began to falter. Sciatica and nervous disorders plagued her, but she directed her energy toward writing poetry. Inspired by her literary idol Heinrich Heine, she crafted deeply introspective verses that she believed were dictated by his spirit, even claiming to see his apparition. These poems, filled with themes of liberty, abandonment, loneliness, and disdain for aristocratic hypocrisy, were intended for future souls and posthumous publication. In 1890, Sisi even went so far as to deposit her manuscripts in Switzerland, distrustful of Austrian authorities and her own family to preserve her legacy. Choosing the date of 1950 for when her poems would be published, she wanted the money from her poems to be dedicated to political prisoners and their families, especially the children who suffered under the Austro-Hungarian Empire. In them, she wrote that she was unable to say these words now, but that in the future they would understand. Many of her poems tried to revenge herself on the Viennese aristocracy and the Habsburgs. She placed fool's caps with bells on many of the court in Vienna, calling them arrogant, addicted to medals, and nothing but shallow, idle pleasure seekers who take advantage of the working class. She questioned monarchy as a form of government and praised the liberal ideas of the day. Her views made a lasting impression on their children. Crown Prince Rudolph and Valeria both believed in republicanism and credited their views to their mother. She believed that if her poems and opinions became known, she would be locked in an asylum. She characterized her husband as unlucky, chosen by fate, imprisoned by his position, and lamenting her inability to help him. Throughout all her poems, Franz Joseph is never once disparaged. Sisi's fascination with Greece also deepened. She studied the language and translated Hamlet from English into Greek. She took long tours of Greece, following in the footsteps of poets, writers, and heroes, traveling the Aegean and getting a tattoo of an anchor on her shoulder to show her love of the sea. In 1886, she constructed a grand castle on Corfu, the Achilleion, dedicated to the mythical hero Achilles, whom she saw as a kindred spirit. Filled with Greek statues, frescoes, and busts of philosophers and poets, the Achilleion became her sanctuary. She walked its grounds at dawn, composing verses and dreaming of freedom. Here, she remarked, Achilles' grief means more than all of life. Starting in the late 1880s, she no longer allowed her ladies in waiting to accompany her on her excursions. At her age, very few people recognized her. Despite her isolation, Sisi's actions sometimes sparked controversy. Her financial support for a Heine memorial in Düsseldorf ignited public outrage in anti-Semitic and nationalist circles, who denounced her as a slave of the Jews. The backlash grew so fierce that Sisi withdrew her sponsorship, but she commissioned a private Heine statue for the Achilleion instead. She had it placed in a serene temple, declaring it a fitting tribute to Heine's love of nature and disdain for human pretension. Throughout these years, Sisi's poetry and travels became her escape. She immersed herself in Greek culture, learning the language and claiming, "I am more Greek than Austrian." But her detachment from court life and the burdens of monarchy alienated her further from Franz Joseph, who, despite his devotion, could not bridge the emotional chasm between them. As the decade closed, Sisi's obsession with solitude and fantasy solidified her transformation into an enigmatic figure. No longer an empress bound by duty, but a self-styled queen of the fairies, lost in her own poetic dreams. Yet behind the mask of mysticism, a woman deeply disillusioned by her role and her world quietly longed for liberation. Sisi, though, still felt compassion for her husband, and no longer the jealousy she had felt when she found out about his first affairs. She wished to provide him with at least some comfort in a companion. It was in 1873 when Franz Joseph, seated beside Sisi at the 25th anniversary of his ascendance to the throne, first laid eyes on Katharina Schratt, a young actress brimming with talent and charm. 10 years passed before their paths crossed again, during which time Katharina had risen to fame and weathered her own struggles, including an ill-fated marriage. By 1885, she was a celebrated star of the Burgtheater, and her path would soon intertwine fatefully with the emperor's once more. For Sisi, who had long abandoned her role as her husband's companion, Katharina Schratt was not a rival but a solution. The empress understood Franz Joseph's isolation better than anyone, and though their marriage had cooled to a mere partnership, she cared deeply for his well-being. Observing his growing fascination with the actress, Sisi took the extraordinary step of facilitating their connection. When Katharina was invited to a royal dinner at Kremsier, seated alongside not only Franz Joseph but also Sisi, the Russian Tsar, and Tsarina, it was no accident. This was Sisi's deliberate intervention, a calculated act of kindness, born of a desire to see her husband find the companionship she could no longer provide. Their friendship blossomed under Sisi's watchful eye. The empress, ever pragmatic, reasoned that Katharina posed no threat to her position or to the delicate balance of court politics. Unlike the aristocratic women Franz Joseph might have turned to, Katharina was a safe choice, an outsider without ambition for power. Sisi herself commissioned portraits of Katharina to gift to Franz Joseph, even accompanying him to a studio where the unsuspecting actress was posing. With her presence, Sisi dispelled any potential impropriety, establishing herself as the quiet guardian of their unusual bond. Far from feeling jealousy, Sisi found comfort in Katharina's presence. As she later confided to her daughter Valerie, with Schratt he can relax. The empress even joined Franz Joseph in some of his visits to Katharina's villa, creating the appearance of a respectable friendship. It was as though she recognized in Katerina the warmth and simplicity Franz Joseph needed, but that Sisi, lost in her own complexities, could no longer provide. Their arrangement brought balance to a fractured family. With Katerina to brighten the emperor's days, Sisi could pursue her endless travels and personal obsessions without guilt. Yet the situation did not escape scrutiny. At court, whispers swirled about the emperor's frequent visits to the Burgtheater and Katerina's rising influence. Even Sisi's daughter, Valerie, expressed unease, though she eventually acknowledged how much good Katerina's presence did for her father. For Sisi, the affair, platonic or not, was a reassurance. Her humor about the situation occasionally surfaced in her poems, where she teased Franz Joseph's infatuation. But ultimately, her acceptance of Katerina Schratt demonstrated Sisi's remarkable complexity. From the start, Sisi's role as a mother to her two younger children was distant and complicated. Sisi, consumed by her own struggles and wanderlust, offered little warmth. Her rare visits to Vienna often transformed her into an almost mythical figure in her son Rudolph's eyes. Not a mother, but a dazzling apparition. The young crown prince idolized her, though more as a dream than a reality. Yet in many ways, Rudolph was Sisi's son, imaginative, sensitive, and intellectual. Like her, he rebelled against the suffocating traditions of the Viennese court. Together, they shared liberal ideals and a fascination with the modern world, starkly at odds with Emperor Franz Joseph's rigid conservatism. But their similarities became a double-edged sword. Their relationship, strained by neglect, left them unable to truly connect. Sisi's affections gravitated toward her youngest daughter, Marie Valerie. For Rudolph, this was a cruel rejection. The bond between mother and son grew increasingly fragile, frayed by jealousy, misunderstandings, and Rudolph's perception of being unloved. When Rudolph married Princess Stephanie of Belgium, Sisi dismissed her daughter-in-law as a mighty bumpkin and delegated to her many of the public duties she herself loathed. The marriage was a disaster, cold, loveless, and rife with resentment. The public was aware of this discord, and Elisabeth and Franz were the last to know. Elisabeth chose not to intervene. I am reluctant to interfere, for I myself suffered so much under my mother-in-law that I do not wish to cause the same issues. Rudolph's unhappiness escalated, his liberal ideals clashing with a court that viewed him as a dangerous outsider. The prince became plagued by depression and sought refuge in secret political writings, extramarital affairs, and even the escapism of ornithology, where he was quite gifted, with many of his publications still widely regarded today. Franz Joseph, too, had a distant relationship with his son, forcing him into the military when he wanted to go to university, rarely showing affection, and only having stifled conversations with him about the army or hunting. Family gatherings were full of silence, dissent, and spite. The irony is that in so many ways he was like his mother, whereas Valerie was much more like Franz Joseph. Rudolph idolized Andrassy, wanted a constitutional republic, and was a liberal. Valerie hated Hungary, despised Andrassy, had no poetic fervor, and harbored nationalist sentiments. But Sisi never felt close to him, never felt she could speak to him as she did with her youngest daughter. And she blamed this on her long-dead mother-in-law for putting a rift between them that could never be healed. In the year 1888, the last Christmas the family spent together, Rudolph paid an outrageous price for 11 Heine autographs and placed them under the tree for his mother. Though she was so preoccupied with her daughter's coming marriage, she barely noticed them. The servants found him sobbing, tear-stained during the occasion. Less than a month later, on January 30th, 1889, the world shattered when Rudolph and his young lover, Mary Vitsera, were found dead at Mayerling. The girl had been killed before Rudolph took his own life. Sisi was the first to hear the devastating news. Elisabeth wept bitterly on the day of her son's funeral, kissed him on the lips, and blamed her daughter-in-law, chastising her. "You hated your father, you did not love your husband, and you do not love your daughter." If he had married a different woman, this would never have happened. Rudolph wrote his goodbye letter to his mother, saying he was not worthy of writing to his father, and that he did not do the action because of the girl. He was not in love with her. He had only taken her along because he feared being alone at the end. He also left a prophetic note to his younger sister Valerie. On the day Papa closes his eyes forever, things will grow very uncomfortable in Austria. I know all too well what will follow, and I advise you to emigrate. Rudolph's death marked the beginning of Sisi's descent into a life consumed by mourning and regret. The family doctor claimed that Rudolph's psychological struggles were the root cause of his tragic end. Sisi was haunted by guilt and sorrow. In her poetry, she attributed Rudolph's madness to her Bavarian blood, lamenting how different and better life might have been for her husband and the empire if he had never married her. Her grief deepened into anger as she anticipated that, after Franz Joseph's death, another family line, the very people who had mocked and scorned her, would inherit the throne. Yet Franz Joseph publicly praised his wife during these dark days. "How much I owe to my wife for these days. I cannot thank heaven enough for giving me such a helpmate." In private, he expressed similar gratitude in letters to Katharina Schratt, declaring his thankfulness to God for Elisabeth's unwavering presence. Sisi, however, withdrew from the world. She donned only black, discarding the jewels and finery that once symbolized her imperial image. Spiritualism became her refuge. She sought to contact Rudolph in the afterlife, making solitary visits to the crypt in the evenings. Her grief drove her to the edge of despair. Her once close relationship with Valerie, her youngest daughter, also began to fracture. Valerie's pragmatic approach to duty and nationalism clashed with Sisi's poetic idealism. Even Valerie's marriage, which Sisi had once championed, came to symbolize another loss. Sisi declared that she had lost all her children and told Valerie that after her marriage, she would no longer be happy to see her again. Rudolph's death was more than a personal tragedy. It marked the unraveling of the Habsburg dynasty. He was a prince trapped between worlds, too modern for the empire he was destined to rule, yet too bound by duty to escape its confines. For Sisi, the fairy tale queen, his death left a void no poetry could fill. She grew increasingly consumed by spiritual and existential reflections, pondering humanity's insignificance and the lack of free will. The losses continued. Just 1 year later, Andrassy, her trusted confidant, passed away. Sisi confided in Valerie that she now felt utterly abandoned and without a true friend. A few months later, Helene, her elder sister, also died. 37 years had passed since the summer that had determined the course of their lives. Both sisters had been surrounded by splendor and glitter, yet carried within them an immense, unshakable emptiness. Helene had been a widow for over 20 years, and her final words to Sisi were poignant. "Life is a sorrow and a misery." Sisi agreed, and Valerie later remarked how deeply her mother now longed for her final rest. Elisabeth's life in her final years mirrored the somber decline of the empire she once symbolized. The marriage of her beloved daughter Valerie marked what should have been a moment of personal triumph. Instead, it became a turning point. The final tether to familial duty severed. Elisabeth declared with melancholic anticipation, "Once Valerie is settled, my seagull flight can begin. I shall roam the world, a female flying Dutchman, until I drown and am forgotten." These words, wistful and foreboding, set the tone for the years ahead, an existence adrift, untethered, and increasingly unmoored from reality. Her beauty, once the envy of Europe, had faded. "As soon as I feel myself aging, I shall retreat from the world," she vowed. True to her word, Elisabeth became a spectral figure, shrouded in black, her face hidden behind veils, fans, and umbrellas. She allowed no portraits or photographs to capture the marks of time. Her refusal to be seen mirrored her retreat from life itself, a deliberate withdrawal into what one observer called the locked gardens of grief. Elisabeth's travels, once purposeful, became compulsive wanderings through Europe and the Mediterranean. She moved from palace to palace, hotel to hotel, seeking escape but finding none. Her journeys were punctuated by bizarre episodes, unannounced visits to strangers' homes, confrontations with startled locals, and relentless exposure to the elements. "Like Odysseus, I tie myself to the mast," she mused during a storm at sea, finding solace in nature's fury while her companions quaked in fear. Her erratic behavior baffled even her closest confidants, who saw in her actions a mix of defiance, melancholy, and madness. Her relationship with Franz Joseph, always fraught, devolved into polite estrangement. The emperor, ever dutiful, expressed his frustrations quietly. His letters reveal a man resigned to his wife's absences, but deeply wounded by them. "You will travel even more and roam the world," he lamented, "and I shall wait, always hoping for your return." Despite this, he maintained his devotion, confiding to his mistress, Katharina Schratt, that Elizabeth's whims, though exhausting, were a burden he bore out of love. For Valerie, Elizabeth's increasingly erratic behavior was a source of anguish. The once close bond between mother and daughter frayed under the weight of Elizabeth's despair. Valerie, pragmatic and devout, could not comprehend her mother's rejection of faith and duty. "She sees the birth of every new life as a misfortune," Valerie confided in her diary, her heart breaking as Elizabeth grew ever more distant. Even her grandchildren, the light of Valerie's life, seemed to bring Elizabeth little joy. As the years wore on, Elizabeth's health deteriorated. Her starvation diets and relentless physical exertions left her emaciated and frail. Yet, she continued to push her body to its limits, as if punishing herself for the losses she had endured. Her servants noted with alarm her refusal to eat and her insistence on grueling routines, describing her as a shadow of her former self. In September 1898, Elizabeth's restless wanderings brought her to Geneva, where she traveled incognito as the Countess of Hohenems. Her presence was revealed in a local newspaper, and fate intervened in the form of an anarchist, Luigi Lucchini. Armed with a sharpened file, he attacked Elizabeth as she walked to the dock for her steamer. The wound was small, the blood slow to spill, and Elizabeth, unaware of the severity, continued on her way. Only after collapsing on the boat did the gravity of the injury become clear. By the time she was returned to her hotel, it was too late. Elizabeth died quietly, without pain, as if slipping into the oblivion she had long craved. For Franz Joseph, the loss of his wife was another blow in a life marked by tragedy. "You do not know how much I love this woman," he said, his grief private but profound. Elizabeth's death left an empire to mourn a figure they barely knew, a queen who had withdrawn from their lives long before her passing. Valerie found solace in the thought that her mother's end had come as she wished. Swift, painless, and without the burden of medical intervention. In death, Elizabeth's enigmatic legacy was sealed. She had spent her life fleeing the responsibilities of her station, yet in doing so, she embodied the contradictions of her time. A woman torn between duty and freedom, privilege and despair. Her refusal to conform, her rejection of the role of empress, and her restless pursuit of a fleeting ideal made her a symbol of a world on the brink of dissolution. Sisi left behind a legacy as haunting and enigmatic as the life she led. Her beauty and rebellion captivated a world bound by tradition, yet her deep melancholy and restless spirit revealed the human fragility behind the imperial facade. She was a queen who defied the expectations of her station, a mother shattered by loss, and a wanderer forever seeking escape from herself. In her retreat from duty and her longing for freedom, she embodied the decline of a gilded age, a symbol of a monarchy that glittered brightly, even as it quietly fractured. Perhaps her own words capture it best. "I fly from all I hold dear, and from all who hold me dear. From love, from grief, from sorrow, I flee into the vast unknown." Thank you for watching this week's video on Elisabeth of Austria. Please let me know your thoughts on Sisi in the comments. Do you think she was a tragic victim of her time? Should she have done more to support an institution she didn't believe in? Sisi is one of the most complex characters we have covered, and her name and story sparks so many views on both sides. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on her and her life, as well as that of her son and the Emperor Franz Joseph. And if there's a remarkable woman you'd like to see in future episodes, let me know. Your likes, shares, and comments mean the world to us. They keep this channel going and help us continue to bring these powerful stories to light. As a small channel that covers women's biographies, your likes, comments, and shares really matter. And if you would like to help support us on Patreon, the link is in the description of this video. We now have almost 70 women's biographies on the channel, so feel free to explore and let me know your favorites. A heartfelt thank you to our patrons: Velocity Girl, ZenLife68, Jillian Barker, Junie Moon, Philip Gallegos, Kingsley Clark, Kafum Chung, Harry Thurston, Karen Craig, Second Soprano 150, Michelle Lynn Neal, Deborah Himes, Bavia Andrea, Tracy Walsh, Elizabeth, CTS Bathory, America Marie, Joy McGuire, and Amber Perry. Your support truly makes this possible. And a special shout out to this week's trivia winner, Bonkers. Well done. And to everyone watching and sharing our passion for history, thank you for helping to make this community so special. So until next time, stay curious, keep exploring, and as always, thank you for watching.